So we've talked about what's in a message. So now let's talk a little bit about what's not in a message. There's a couple phrases and terms that are commonly used, but just aren't recommended when we're talking about giving a recovery message, especially from an advocacy standpoint. And these words may be very important to some people. And again, it's not our job to say don't use these. What recovery community messaging training tries to do is help people speak with a common language, help people speak in a language that's affirming from a public perception standpoint, in a way that informs policy decisions in a very different way. So this is the perspective I'm coming from when we talk about recovery community messaging training and what's not in a message and why. The first is I'm an addict or an alcoholic. And the rationale for avoiding terms like this is because in general the public thinks that we are still sick, that we're not well. And it has a very different view. I remind you of earlier when that word came up and kind of what emotions, words, and images it brought up for you. And we can imagine that there's a full spectrum of images, feelings, words that this might bring up for people, especially policymakers as they're making very important decisions. I'm a recovering addict or alcoholic. Now, we avoid terms like recovering because, again, this suggests illness rather than wellness. Again, people in recovery are thriving towards this quality of life. And it's really less about am I using or not, and it's more about the lifestyle that I'm living. So recovering says that I'm sort of not there, I'm not well. We don't talk about addiction being a disease. Even though we've learned about the science of addiction and the American Society of Addiction Medicine's classification of addiction as a disease, when we're talking about advocacy and we're talking with the general public and decision makers about recovery, we don't want to get into this debate about whether it is or isn't a disease, because quite frankly, some people do not believe that it's a disease. So we don't want to get into this debate and distract from what we're trying to do. We're trying to share the hope of recovery. We're not trying to talk about information regarding specific pathways of recovery or 12-step fellowships, for example, because we know there are many pathways and have a strong, and many people have strong beliefs in one as opposed to the other. So it's not time for us to argue about what pathway is better or not. We don't include a definition of recovery, and we don't do this because we know that one individual's experience in recovery may not mirror or match another individual's experience in recovery. We believe that, again, recovery is this individually defined construct. So again, we don't want to get into an argument about our definition of recovery being the only definition of recovery. In thinking about language, there are some words we want to abandon, some words we want to debate, and then some words we want to elevate. So let's start with some words we want to abandon. The first being the word abuse, typically used in substance abuse, substance abuser, things like that. The research evidence is unequivocal. It is shown for decades that when using terms like substance abuse or substance abuser, this results in more punitive responses and greater blame upon the individual, and this is even among treatment providers. It's also important to remind us that the term substance use disorder is now in line with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Additionally, remember that substance abuse disorders no longer exist in the current edition of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Now we talk about substance use disorders as being the appropriate and accurate clinically term. We don't talk about self-help because experience shows us that recovery is a process that's best achieved when the family and the community and other allies and peers come together to support the individual. So it's less about self-help and more about the community coming around individuals and helping to enhance that recovery process. We don't use things like untreated alcoholics or untreated addicts. And we don't do this because this involves, again, labels related to an illness. And it also implies that all forms of recovery can only be achieved through some professional means. Referring to people still suffering from addiction as people who have not yet found recovery is a far more accurate and preferable phrase than depicting such folks as untreated. We also try to avoid a language of self-pity. It's about focusing on strengths. Recovery emerges from hope and acts of courage and perseverance and resilience. Any language that even hints at self-pity will delegitimize the recovery movement. So while the new recovery advocacy movement, like its predecessors, is at least in part a rights movement, this is not the moment to push such issues to the forefront. What we do need, what is needed, is that we strike strong emotional chords in the culture at large and the people that we're talking to. What will get America's attention is not a call for sympathy or to redress past ills and decisions that have been made, but rather to enhance and elevate, again, the hope of people in recovery. So we want to articulate themes like gratitude, responsibility, and serving, and service that is so important to many people who are in recovery. There are some things we need to debate, like treatment works. We know treatment has an effect, but for many it has not worked. So treatment has oftentimes overshadowed the larger and more enduring recovery process. So we need to debate this and figure out ways to enhance the treatment process, and by including people in recovery in that conversation. Thinking about terms like consumer, like untreated alcoholics or untreated addicts, this term implies that all people in recovery have been or need to be consumers of treatment services. So by speaking of consumer or this consumer representation, that language narrows participation in policy development to people who have participated in treatment rather than to this larger pool of people who have lived with an addiction and people who are now living in recovery, especially those people who may have not utilized formalized treatment. We need to debate stigma. While the new recovery advocacy movement has many facets, it's just as much a rights movement as a movement that simply seeks to change the social acceptance of people with addiction and people who are in recovery. Our focus on stigma must be focused on the way that stigma is manifested in discriminatory laws, policies, and practices. So, it's less about, oh my gosh, stigma exists, but it's how does this stigma influence policies that are discriminatory in nature, and how does this limit capital of people in recovery and frankly put barriers in people in recovery's way to achieve full wellness and full quality of life, and in my opinion create barriers and additional stress that could lead someone back to use. So instead of just, oh my gosh, the stigma exists, it's how does this stigma influence these policies that are being made? And then also there's this idea of internalized stigma. No matter what stigma exists in society, but how is that stigma internalized by individuals in recovery? There's been a term in the recovery and addiction world for a long time called enabling, and typically enablers. And typically this term has been helpful to kind of identify a way of interacting with people who are active in their addiction that sort of promoted their addiction or made it easier for their addiction to be maintained. And people in the social work field have really launched an advocacy effort to reclaim this word, to help people be enabled to achieve recovery, to begin the recovery process, to access treatment and resources. So it's not that people enable folks to maintain their addiction, but the fact that people help enable other people to seek recovery and to sustain recovery. And relapse. Relapse is a word that has garnered lots of debate. Relapse, again, puts it in this medical realm where we start talking more about the disease model of addiction rather than the hope of recovery. So this can interfere with that hope of recovery. So when we talk about relapse, it's just something we want to continue to debate and discuss. Some people recommend saying return to use, or recurrence of use instead of relapse. And again, there's not a right or wrong way to use this. The point is, these are kind of terms that we want to continue to debate and discuss while still putting that focus on the hope of recovery. And with all of this language that we're talking about, that's really that's the underlying message. It's less about addiction, it's less about the consequences of addiction, it's less about hot button topics, and it's just more about the reality of the 23.5 million Americans that identify living and thriving in their recovery each day. It's more about showing people that recovery is possible. That is our intention. With that being said, there are words and concepts that we need to elevate and we need to celebrate. And the first is person-first language. When we refer to people, we want to say that they are a person first. So they are a person with a substance use disorder, a person in recovery. We saw this movement in the disability rights movement where they were people with disabilities, not disabled people. So we're not talking about addicts, we're not talking about addicted people. We are talking about people who live with addiction, or people with substance use disorders, or people in recovery. So anytime you have the opportunity to talk about recovery, to talk about recovery communities, to talk about communities of recovery, we just want to say recovery as much as we can, and to make sure that the voice of recovery and the faces of recovery are involved in those decision-making processes that affect students' lives. So that at every table, at every committee, at every task force, there's a face and a voice of recovery there to make sure that a true recovery-oriented system of care is in place. So because we want to enlarge the public's understanding that there are many people for whom recovery is important, we want to also highlight the importance of individuals, friends, families, and allies. So we want to highlight the experiences of recovery for everyone, not just the individual in recovery, but everyone around that individual, and how we see that infectious nature of recovery create waves and ripples throughout the larger community. Those are the things that we want to elevate.